Hello everyone and welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin as always, and today I apologize if my throat sounds a little bit more hoarse than usual today. I live in Oregon and we have a ton of fires going on right now and there's a ton of smoke in the air, and so my apologies, but hopefully the lemon raspberry tea that I'm drinking today will help with that. And today I want to talk to you guys about Montezuma and the invasion of the Aztecs by the Spanish. And originally last week I referred to it as the Revenge of Montezuma, but as I started to do more research for this episode to refresh me up on Montezuma and the invasion of Cortes, I kept getting results for traveler's diarrhea and food poisoning that attacks tourists traveling to Mexico. So let me be very clear that this is not what that's about. So this is actually about the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, and our two big players are Montezuma II, the Tlatoani, or the ruler of the Aztec Empire, and Hernan Cortes, a Spanish conquistador who brought a great deal of what is now Mexico under the rule of the King of Castile. So this story takes place in the early 16th century. I think a lot of us, when we think of the Aztecs, we kind of imagine that they're a bit more of an ancient civilization, but they're actually contemporary with a lot of famous European figures like Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VIII, famous figures like these. And at this time in Europe, the desire for exploration and conquest was really on the rise, especially after Christopher Columbus, quote-unquote, found America in 1492 and shared the enviable exploits with his wealthy royal Spanish patrons. So Spain, now on a kick from the discoveries and the trade possibilities, decided to continue exploration of the Americas in order to see what else they could find. So the expeditions of the territories that would become known as the Spanish Main took place from around 1493 to about 1515. And the Spanish worked on colonizing the Caribbean territories and a great deal of North America, including what is now Florida, Texas, and parts of the Gulf of Mexico. However, there were still parts of the Gulf of Mexico that were not yet colonized by Europeans, but instead were part of the Aztec Empire, which was derived from the Mexica people. Now, the Mexica migrated from the north to the Valley of Mexico due to the fertile land and the trading opportunities with neighboring people. And so the Mexica picked up some of the culture of the surrounding people and developed a worship of the god of war and sun, who we refer to as Quetzalcoatl. And eventually they ended up on the shores of Lake Texcoco. And the legend actually says that they decided to stay there when they saw an eagle with a snake in its mouth land on a cactus. So while these people called themselves the Mexica, they eventually became known as the Aztecs, and they developed permanent settlement, building aqueducts and entering into alliances with other city-states. This is significant because for most of the 15th century, the Aztecs consolidated their control over a great deal of what is now modern Mexico. And we usually tend to have this view of the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Toltecs, people like these, living in just sort of a small village, but that's actually a false assumption. It actually rivaled Constantinople in size, and it made London and Paris and Venice look absolutely tiny. So that'll give you an idea of just how big of a civilization the Aztecs have. So as we mentioned before, they incorporated a great deal of the neighboring culture and language, and they developed a really interesting bureaucratic political system in which the Aztec ruler was advised by a small council of lords, and there were tax collectors who were considered the most important government officials as they collected tributes and took military action against those who wouldn't pay their tribute. And the class system in the Aztec Society was very rigid, and the majority of the population consisted of commoners, indentured servants, and slaves. They were members of large kinship groups called capulis, and each capuli had an elected chief who ran its affairs and acted as a go-between between the central government. So regarding religion, Aztecs believed in two worlds, the material world in which they lived and the divine world where the gods lived. And human beings could achieve a better life, but they first had to pass a judgment. And so they made human sacrifice a common practice in an attempt to postpone the day of reckoning and to gain favor with the gods. And because this was such a common practice, the purpose of warfare soon went from just gaining more territory for the empire to having a larger group of people that you could capture and then offer as tribute. So Aztec society is significant because its civilization is one of the most densely populated places in the world at the time, and the society structure demonstrates the values that are important to the Aztec people. They clearly have a great emphasis on military importance, but at the core of everything, they have a very big big emphasis on the divine world, and that religion is at the center of a great deal of the Aztec motivation. So in this alliance that eventually formed the Aztec Empire, there were three main cities. We had Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, which formed a triple alliance back in 1428 to strengthen their territories. And in 1502, our boy Montezuma was elected emperor of this formidable empire, and he's mainly recognized for expanding the territories of the empire and consolidating power in those territories. Oh, and he's also remembered for getting killed during the Spanish invasion of Mexico. But we'll be getting into that in a little bit. So while Montezuma is leading Aztec Society with its bountiful stock of humans ripe for sacrifice, some strange things started to happen around the city of Tenochtitlan. So a lot of people, because they have a great deal of religious emphasis in their culture, began to interpret these as omens. Many of the omens included things such as a flying ear of corn in the eastern sky, a sacred temple catching fire even though no one seemed to have started it, and it burned to the ground even when the people tried to stop it. A lot of these omens involve fire. People say they saw fire streaming through the sky in 3 parts, which is considered to be a sign of the gods. Another sign included another temple being struck by a lightning bolt, and another included wind hitting the water so abruptly that it rose and struck against a wall of houses and flooded a great deal of territory and caused houses to collapse into the water. And another included the sound of a woman weeping in the night for her children, which, if you've ever heard of the tale of La Llorona, that sounds very eerily familiar. And another person says that they saw a strange crane captured, and supposedly on its head Montezuma saw a prophecy of war. And lastly, people say that there were monstrous beings that appeared in the city, like men with 2 heads and 1 body, and by the time they took them to go see Montezuma, they would disappear before their eyes. So naturally the natives were overcome with terror because regardless of whether or not you're religious, these are some really strange things, and people weren't really sure how to react to this. Some people were weeping and shouting, and they were frantically trying to sacrifice more human beings, and they thought that the gods were upset with them, so their solution was to offer a surplus of sacrifices to the gods in order to appease them. And they spoke of the omens constantly and tried to imagine what they meant, and they begged seers and supposed magicians to interpret them. They wanted to know what was going on and what was coming that could be so terrible. And meanwhile, over in Europe, an up-and-coming explorer named Hernan Cortes had developed something of a resume for himself. He had traveled to San Domingo in 1504 and eventually earned himself an encomienda, which is basically a group of native slave laborers, so that's great. And in 1506, he also aided in the conquest of Hispaniola and Cuba and earned himself a bit of a name and was able to garner some more leadership positions, but he often found himself in rivalry with some of the people that were organizing the expeditions. And so in 1518, he wanted to go on an expedition to explore more of the mainland. And originally he was allowed to do it, but then the leader who he had kind of come toe-to-toe with a couple times in Cuba withdrew his permission, and Cortes decided to go anyway. And he clearly had a lot of influence because in little to no time at all, he was able to gather 300 men and 6 ships for the journey. And after a brief top-up in Cuba to gather some more men and horses for the trip, they sail all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula. The main motivation for Cortes going to this land is he heard that there was just an insane abundance of silver and gold to be collected. And he knew that even if he were to be in trouble for this expedition, if he can find these incredible resources to be exploited for the royalty of Spain, then he's going to have himself in a grand old position right there. It's not going to matter that he broke the rules at all. Once they landed the Yucatan Peninsula, he met a priest who had escaped from the Mayans and had learned some of the languages of the people nearby so he could help Cortes communicate with some of the local people. Then, in March 1519, Cortes formally claimed the land for the Spanish crown, and in the town of Tabasco, some of the natives initially tried to resist the Spanish efforts, but the Spanish ultimately won the battle, and Cortes received 20 young women for their victory. That's a big yikes. Eventually, these women all converted to Christianity, and among them was a woman named La Malinche, who would eventually become Cortes's mistress and the father of San Martin. And she was essential to Cortes's efforts because she was able to help them navigate, she was familiar with the land, and she would be able to help them communicate with the Aztecs. So Cortes was able to make some alliances with the people in the surrounding areas of Tenochtitlan, as a lot of them decided that it wouldn't really be worth their time to fight the Spanish because Obviously, the Spanish have stronger weapons. They are a pretty fearful sight, and to a lot of the people, they're still not entirely certain whether or not they're gods, so it's best to play it on the safe side. However, in the neighboring city of Cholula, Cortes massacred thousands of people and set fire to the city as a warning to Tenochtitlan. So the people in Cholula had assembled in the courtyard of their patron god without any suspicion of the danger, but the Spanish closed off the entrances so that no one could escape, and that was when they realized the Spanish weren't there to be friendly, they were there to do harm to them. So they had to face the Spaniards without weapons, and there was just this massive slaughter. So going back to Montezuma consulted with various seers and more magicians to learn about whether or not these omens signified an oncoming war, but he was even more distressed by the news of the arrival of the Spaniards than he had been by the omens, because now these omens are coming to fruition. So Montezuma sent an emissary to observe the strangers and see if they could determine what their presence meant. But when he received no good news, he requested to have 2 of the best artisans brought to him, and he requested that they make a great deal of beautiful artifacts out of gold and decorate them with emeralds and feathers. And he sent the messengers and the gifts to these odd strangers because he believed that they might be Quetzalcoatl and they could potentially be other divinities returning to Mexico as their traditions had promised. So Montezuma sent... We have a long list of some of the items that he sent. He sent a serpent mask, a shield, a collar, a pendant, a mirror, a spear thrower, a bracelet, a pair of sandals, a helmet, earrings, a vest, a cloak, a jaguar skin diadem, and many divine adornments. And all of these were made of some form of precious material like gold, turquoise, or feathers. So running back to Montezuma, the messengers reported what they had seen and what food the Spaniards ate. They also described the cannons to Montezuma as like a ball of stone coming out of a tube's entrails. It shoots sparks and it rains fire, because they've never seen something like this before, so this is a really fearsome thing to see. And they also said that the Spaniards were almost entirely armor and that they rode on the backs of deer because there weren't horses over in the Americas at this point. And they said that they have white skin and some have black hair, some have yellow hair, and they described their food as large and white but not heavy and like straw with a taste of cornstalk. And they also said that they had enormous dogs with flat ears and dangling tongues. So Montezuma decides to send out his most gifted men, his prophets, his wizards, his most noble and brave warriors to go out, and they take with them provisions like live hens, eggs, and tortillas, as well as captives to be sacrificed to the Spanish, because they believed the Spanish were gods, but when they sacrificed the captives in front of the Spanish explorers, they were absolutely horrified and disgusted and refused to take any of the gifts. So Montezuma sent the magicians and his warriors to see if it was possible that they could fight the Spanish, but they ultimately decided it wasn't going to be a safe adventure. So he didn't know what to do or what would happen to the city, and he also learned that the gods wished to see him face to face, and he was absolutely terrified by this, and he wasn't sure what to do, so he contemplated running away and just living in a cave, but ultimately he couldn't really make up his mind, so he just kind of stayed frozen in place. So eventually the Spaniards entered the city and they saw gold and precious metals all around, and it was said that they just burst into smiles at the sight of all the glittering metals and jewels, and the Aztecs compared them to monkeys picking them up and examining them. So they noticed that the Spanish were very hungry for these precious items, and they thought that they were greedy beings and that they had hearts full of lust. And they were ultimately somewhat undecided on how to view these strange visitors, because perhaps the gods would be above the material wealth, and they were disgusted by the sacrifices that were offered to them, so they weren't sure what these visitors wanted or what they were going to do. So Montezuma, to greet the Spanish, dressed in his finest clothing, and he had trays of flowers brought and presented as a gift of welcome. And so Cortes asked if he was the true Montezuma, and he said yes, and invited them to come and rest and take possession of their royal houses. Cortes then told Montezuma that they were his friends and they didn't have to worry about anything, and they even shook hands with Montezuma and patted him on the back to show affection to him. And then the Spanish examined everything that they saw and ultimately decided that the friendship had lasted long enough. So they arrested Montezuma and kept him under guard, and then they fired one of the cannons to cause confusion in the city and have people scatter everywhere. And then they requested food and supplies from Montezuma as well as gold, which they ended up melting down. So what's interesting is the accounts that we have of this meeting between the Aztecs and the Spanish is very different due to the fact that each of the groups had different intentions. The Spanish, who went into the city with the intent to plunder and gather riches, viewed the people of Montezuma as savages that were uncivilized, while the Aztecs viewed the Spanish as these strange and dangerous beasts. And once they realized that they weren't gods, they were hoping that they would be able to tread carefully with them so they wouldn't harm them and let them preserve the city. And some accounts even say that Montezuma offered to give up his kingdom, but this has been pretty much debunked. But it does give you an idea of the fear that the Aztec people were experiencing. So while Montezuma was being kept prisoner, Cortes had to take a leave of absence to find another conquistador who had been sent to Mexico to arrest him for going on this expedition without permission and basically exploring and massacring without permission as well. With the permission, honestly, the massacring probably would have been allowed, but, you just have to get it written in paper. Bureaucracy, right? But once Cortes left, things only got worse for the Aztecs and for Montezuma. And I'll get into that after this.
Hey, I'm Aram.
And I'm Mom.
We want to invite you to listen to our podcast, Hip and Humble. We talk about all things antique and collectible.
We explore the history and the origin of all the treasures we find. Antiques provide us that tangible link between history and today's world.
Mom and I try to bridge the generational gap by exploring our different perspectives through research, humor, and just a taste of sarcasm. Please join us as we explore and breathe humor into antiques and collectibles. Find us on Spotify and GoingSoloMedia.com. Stay hip
and humble.
And now, back to the story. So Cortes had left his buddy Pedro de Alvarado in charge while he was gone. So while Alvarado was in charge, Montezuma asked if the people would be allowed to celebrate Toxcatl, which was a celebration of one of their main gods, Tezcatlipoca. And initially, they were told that they were allowed to celebrate, and the celebration involved a great deal of dancing on the part of the men, especially the warriors, and people would come to watch, so it meant that everybody would be together out in the open. But because they would all be together, the Spanish saw this festival as an opportunity to eliminate part of the threat that the Aztecs posed. So once the people were gathered there, the Spanish closed the entrances and passageways so no one could escape, like they did in the city of Cholula, and they slaughtered as many of the celebrants as they could, particularly the men. And this large proximity of people at the festival meant they were allowed to take out many of the warriors that posed a threat to the Spanish. This also allowed the Spanish a chance to demonstrate their power with a large population of the Aztecs watching them. And some people managed to escape by climbing over walls. Some people weren't so lucky and were trying to hide under the dead, but they would eventually get up and the Spanish would see that they were still alive and come after them. This shattered any illusion left for the Aztec people that these people were their friends or that they were gods. So the Aztecs then responded by spreading the news of the massacre, and they say a great cry went up throughout the city, calling the people to arms because the strangers had murdered their warriors. So it was up to them to take them out. So the captains assembled at once and carried their spears and their shields and began to battle with the Spanish, and they attacked with javelins, arrows, and spears, and they forced the Spanish to ultimately take refuge in the palace. Once the Spanish were inside, they used Montezuma as a hostage, and so Montezuma tried to speak to the people and told them not to fight for the sake of the elderly and for the children, but the people thought that he was being a coward for saying this, and when they took the palace under siege, they killed anyone who seemed to be delivering aid to the Spanish. Eventually, when Cortes came back, the Aztecs had planned to ambush him, but ultimately Cortes returned to the city safely. They waited to see what his next move of action was going to be, but they soon realized Cortes wasn't going to leave the city. They thought that after the massacre they would have everything they need and leave them alone, but they weren't going anywhere. So they retaliated and they rallied their remaining warriors against the Spanish in a very fierce battle that would last ultimately an entire week. Now, it's not certain whether Montezuma was actually killed by the Spanish or by his own people, but Montezuma tried to admonish his people for fighting, and they cursed him and they said that he was a coward and a traitor to his people, and they even threatened him with weapons. If this is true, then it makes sense why the Aztecs would kill him. So the different accounts on his death say, in one situation, that an Indian killed him with a stone from his sling, but the servants in the palace supposedly state that the Spaniards had stabbed him in the stomach with their swords. So eventually, the Spanish abandoned the city, and the Aztecs celebrated because they thought that they were finally gone, and they began to repair their temples and to fix the city and restore peace. But even while the Spanish weren't in the city, they left behind a bit of a present for the Aztecs. And surprise, it was smallpox. And it wiped out a huge chunk of the Aztec population, and whoever didn't die was usually left disfigured by the disease. And once again, things were continuing to get even worse. So the Spanish returned, and this time with a vengeance. The Spanish used brigantines to siege the city, and so they mounted cannons to their ship and sailed towards the Aztec people. And they took everything that they could find and they loaded it onto their ships, and they destroyed the walls that the natives had built to block the progress of the Spanish. But the Aztecs were able to somewhat defend themselves from the cannon fire. Rather than running straight from the cannon fire, they ran to the right or the left, or they threw themselves on the ground to lay flat, or took cover among houses until the cannons had passed over them. And the common people had gathered their family into canoes and fled via Lake Texcoco, while the warriors stayed to fight. And obviously this was a difficult situation because these people were abandoning their homes and their possessions, but it was either you abandon your home or you give up your life, and potentially the lives of the people that you love. So the Spanish eventually anchored a short distance from the houses, and they continued to fire at the walls that the Aztecs built, and then they filled the canal until the surface was level with the causeway, so they could eventually enter the city. The Spanish blockade led to great anguish in the city. The people that remained there were beginning to starve, and many of them, if they didn't starve to death, they survived off of what they could find, whether it be lizards, swallows, corn cobs, salt grasses of the lake, water lilies, colorin seeds, deer hides, leather, weeds, and even dirt. And there wasn't any fresh water as well, so a lot of people died of dysentery or dehydration. The Spanish also continued to massacre people who attempted to fight back in what's called the Battle of the Marketplace. So the Spanish essentially went to the marketplace of the main city of Tenochtitlan, and in an effort to show off their power, they rode in a great circle and they stabbed Aztec warriors and trampled people with their horse hooves, and they set fire to a temple and burned it down. And the Aztec warriors were unprepared in the beginning, but towards the end of the battle, they eventually began to run in pursuit. And eventually, a great deal of the nobles gathered together in an attempt to figure out what to do, and ultimately they decided that they had to surrender. There was no way they were ever going to defeat the Spanish. They had just done too much damage to them. However, when they sent their new leader, Cuauhtémoc, in a canoe to visit the Spanish at their ships, the Spanish fired their cannons, and supposedly they didn't intend to hit anybody, but honestly, if someone's shooting a cannon at you, it's not going to look very friendly, so the remaining natives decided it was best to fight the Spaniards, but again, this didn't go well. The Spaniards started to kill, and a great deal of many people died, so the Aztecs attempted to flee across the lake, and the majority left under the cover of night. So then the Spanish went off to search for fleeing inhabitants, and they took some of the men that they found and they branded them with hot irons. And on the day that the city was taken, the Spaniards committed some of their most brutal acts yet, and the people of the territories that they had allied with that were enemies of the Aztec Empire were invited to come and basically enact their revenge upon their enemies. So the leader, Cuauhtémoc, had attempted to fight back but was pursued by canoe, and when he saw the enemy would overtake him, he ultimately gave up and surrendered, and he asked Cortes to kill him because the city had already been destroyed and his people were already killed. So because he felt like he failed as a leader, he didn't deserve to be alive. And of the 300,000 warriors that defended the Aztec Empire, only 60,000 remained. And then the Spaniards went on to loot the city of whatever silver and gold and precious items they could find. So one thing I found while I was researching, there's this poem entitled Flowers and Songs of Sorrow, and it describes the state of the Aztecs after this very treacherous takeover by the Spanish, and I'm going to read it to you here. Nothing but flowers and songs of sorrow are left in Mexico and Teotihuacan, where once we saw warriors and wise men. We know it is true that we must perish, for we are mortal men. You, the giver of life, you have ordained it. We wander here and there in our desolate poverty. We are mortal men. We have seen bloodshed and pain, where once we saw beauty and valor. We are crushed to the ground. We lie in ruins. There is nothing but grief and suffering in Mexico and Teotihuacan, where once we saw beauty and valor. Have you grown weary of your servants? Are you angry with your servants, O giver of life? So ultimately, through this poem and through all the evidence we've seen, the impact of the Spanish exploration and of other European exploration is ultimately the death of millions of natives. We see the collapse of empires and the bleeding dry of land, of its resources. But at least we can take comfort in the fact that even though the Aztec nation was crushed, and despite the great amount of death and destruction, the people that survived have been able to preserve some of their unique culture that still exists today, preserving and fostering recapturing their ancestral and cultural identities, and the intellectual effort of a growing number of people in the area is contributing to a renaissance of new literature known as the New Word, ultimately creating a victory over the destruction of the Spanish, because despite their efforts, there are still people descended from the Aztecs that are alive and able to help spread knowledge of just how devastating this plunder really was. And now, everyone goes on to say that Montezuma also got his revenge, which, as Urban Dictionary tastefully reminds us, is when basically someone from Des Moines who thinks salt is spicy might experience a little bit of digestion problems when they travel to Mexico. So that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode or if you like the podcast, please feel free to like, comment, follow, subscribe, whatever the platform you listen to allows you to do. I'd also like to give a shout out to Aram and Kimberly over at the Hip and Humble podcast. They've been absolute sweethearts to work with, and you should totally check out their podcast because it's absolutely fascinating. You can also follow me on Instagram at Tea Time Thoughts Podcast. I post updates about the podcast episodes, and I also open up my inbox to idea suggestions. So if you have an idea that you'd like to share, please feel free to do so. I also have a YouTube channel, also called Tea Time Thoughts Podcast. I upload videos on there in case you have issues with international blockage, depending on where you live, and there are no ads on it, so you can listen to it completely uninterrupted. So thank you very much for listening. This is Tea Time Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next week.